Please give a warm Georgia Tech welcome to Admiral James Ellis, Jr.
Well, I'm a pacer by style, so it comes from my background, I guess, as a Navy fighter pilot. It's harder to hit a moving target, so I keep going back and forth up here. And as you can see from the title and the introduction that Alex gave, I'm going to try and touch on each of these subjects, largely because they said you could talk about anything you wanted, and I thought that'd be more interesting than anything else I could talk about, like the price of soybean futures or something like that, about which I know absolutely nothing. So these are some things that I have been involved in the course of my life, and certainly I love to share those experiences with others. But in no way should you assume that this is the solution, or that this is the checklist, or that this is the way that it ought to be done. As I mentioned with some of the students that I spoke with before we convened here, this is something you learn as you go. And certainly as human beings, we make mistakes, we learn from them, we grow and we evolve, and certainly if you're thoughtful about it, that process never stops. And certainly it hasn't stopped for me, but it's been an interesting journey, and I'd like to share some elements of that with you. As Alex mentioned, I now lead the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which is a nonprofit founded by the commercial nuclear power industry within months after the 3 Mile Island accident. So it was created as a self-regulatory entity to ensure that the industry performed to the highest levels of safety and reliability, not minimum regulatory compliance, but highest levels of safety and reliability. I got into the nuclear business in a bit of a different way. There are some in the audience here that got into the nuclear business early in their Navy careers. I was a late in life nuke, okay? And I was not a submarine officer, as you can infer from the earlier remarks. I was a Navy fighter pilot. But in order to command a nuclear aircraft carrier in the United States Navy, you have to be two things. You have to be an aviator, and you have to be a nuclear engineer. And since those two things do not occur naturally in nature, the Navy has created a process that after some progression through your career, if you end up commanding a squadron, as I was fortunate enough to do, they look into your background. And guess what they saw? They saw a master's degree in aerospace engineering from Georgia Tech. And they said, this guy might just be capable of handling nuclear power school and the math. And off I went to nuclear power school as a Navy captain, sat in a classroom with 34 ensigns, mostly out of Caltech, I think, and 2 years later I graduated certified for the maintenance and operation of Navy nuclear power plants, and was fortunate in a few years after that to command a nuclear-powered aircraft carrier, the USS Abraham Lincoln. That's how I got into the nuclear business. But that wasn't the only piece of it. Years later, I ended up commanding the United States Strategic Command. It's not about me and all of that, but that was the command that oversees the nation's nuclear weapons stockpile, has interactions with the laboratory complex and the like. And so I had Navy nuclear propulsion, I had the nuclear weapons, and as the folks in the industry here and in Georgia told me when I finally came to INPO, they said, you've come in from the dark side, and you are now a part of the commercial nuclear industry, and which is involved in the use of the nuclear energy source for the betterment of mankind. And I'll talk a little bit about that to start with. Then I'll talk about energy in general and its link to prosperity. And then if you're patient enough with me, I'll give you some musings on leadership lessons that I've learned along my way. Not the solution, not the answer, because your journey is just as legitimate as mine and your experiences are just as legitimate as mine. But I would submit that since most of you are 40 years younger than I am, your experience perhaps haven't piled up as high as mine have been, and they might not be the same path that I've been fortunate enough to take. So somebody once told me if you want to get a new idea, you read an old book. And so one of the things I'd like to start with is the history of the nuclear business. People tend to think of nuclear energy as, well, that's kind of old news. What we'd forget, because most of us weren't around then, that it was the dot-com of its time. It was absolutely extraordinary, the progression and the rate of progress, that we went through in the nuclear enterprise in the late 30s and early 40s. The industry itself, if you measure it by the first time that the atom was split, is just a little bit over 70 years old. It was 1938 that Otto Hahn and Fritz Strassmann, two German engineers, first split the atom. And it was in 1942, in what you see depicted here, that the first sustained chain reaction was created in a nuclear pile, they called it then, a pile of graphite and uranium that Enrico Fermi put together in the squash court under the stadium at the University of Chicago. Now, do you think OSHA would let us get away with that today? I mean, no kidding. I mean, this was where they generated the first sustained nuclear reaction. That's what you see a picture of there, 1942. Just 4 years after they first split the atom, we now have a sustained nuclear reaction, all right? And this is the guy that did it. I didn't know Fermi. I'm not that old. You may find that hard to believe, but he's got to have a sense of humor, which kind of disabuses the folks that aren't engineers and thinks that engineers and scientists don't have a sense of humor. But this is what he said. He says, hey, you can't lose in this game. You know, only two possible outcomes. If the result confirms what you're expecting, then you've made a measurement. If you get something different than you expect, congratulations, you made a discovery. So you're a winner in either way. So he had to have a sense of humor about him. Very quickly, though, after 42, in the summer of 45, in the Alamogordo test site out in New Mexico, the first unconstrained release of nuclear energy took place at the Trinity test site. And as we all know well from our history, about a month and a half later, two of those devices were employed to help end the war in the Pacific and indeed to end World War II. That was the unconstrained release of energy. But very, very quickly, thoughtful people decided that there has to be a way to use this energy source in a much more effective way to constrain the release of that in a way that it can be used for productive purposes. The Navy was the lead in that. That isn't an exercise in self-aggrandizement. It's just a fact, because they saw real value in creating a nuclear reactor that could essentially allow submarines to stay submerged for extended periods of time instead of the experience that we had from diesel submarines in the Second World War. And they created a nuclear plant intending to power USS Nautilus, which is what you see, hull number 571 there. My mother grew up in New London, Connecticut. All my uncles worked at Electric Boat. My first science project was an attempt to make a working model of a nuclear power plant using strawberry Kool-Aid as the coolant. I have to tell you, in the interest of full disclosure, that the tube leaked. I spilled Kool-Aid all over the gym floor, and I got a C. So I had a loss of coolant accident early in my career. So the fact of the matter is, though, this was a historic moment. I mean, and think about the pace of technology again and the role of leaders in making that happen. Okay? The keel was laid on Nautilus in June of 1952, and the ship was launched in January of 1954. Ladies and gentlemen, we can't write the specification for a nuclear submarine in 18 months, and they built and launched one in those days. Again, from 1945, where we had the first explosion, to now 1952, we actually operated a reactor ashore in Idaho at the test site out there, where I went to prototype, as a matter of fact, years ago. But they now had one that was being used in a revolutionary way to allow literally the dreams of Jules Verne to be realized in 20,000 leagues under the sea. The commander of that submarine was a Commander Eugene P. Dennis Wilkinson, and the famous message that he sent when they got underway in September of that year was underway on nuclear power. And indeed, it marked a real transformation. But again, think of the progression from 38 to 42 to 45, now to 54, and think of how things are going. And in the midst of all of this, the policy issues associated with nuclear energy were huge. We just had the 50th anniversary of Dwight Eisenhower's farewell speech as president. It was last week, would have been the 50th anniversary of that. What you may not remember is in 1953, he gave a very, very famous Atoms for Peace speech in the United Nations. And this is a picture of that, December 8th, 1953, where Eisenhower talked about stripping the military patina, the military shell off nuclear energy. He actually proposed the creation of the International Atomic Energy Agency and was going to give them all of the nuclear material for the betterment of mankind, and they would share it for everyone's collective prosperity. Obviously, even though that grizzled World War II veteran proposed it, it did not win universal approval or approbation. The arms race was on. The Russians had the bomb. The Chinese were soon to follow. And as we all know, the Cold War was off and running. So it didn't play out that way. But even then, the focus was beginning to be on how can we use this energy source for peaceful purposes other than the explosions that were part of the nuclear stockpile. And there were a lot of things that were considered. This is a a picture of the Kiwi. This is a nuclear rocket, okay, that was created and built and tested in New Mexico in the early 50s. The theory was that instead of having a fuel and an oxidizer, as you classically do in a rocket, all you needed was some kind of a fuel. And they just wanted, we're going to use hydrogen. You're going to blow it. The heat source was going to be a series of uranium fuel elements, and you were going to blow the hydrogen over this thing. You were going to expand this thing adiabatically through a nozzle, and you were going to generate thrust. And the second and third stages of the Saturn V rocket were the goal. They were going to design nuclear engines for those things because, in actuality, it's much more efficient because you don't have to have both oxidizer and fuel. You only have to have one in order to do this, and you get twice the specific impulse out of the thing. Now, the problems are that when they blew the hydrogen over the hot fuel elements, they had a bad habit of spitting fuel elements out the rocket nozzle, and they didn't quite figure out how they were going to do this if they had an accident with the Saturn V over South Florida, and the upper two stages were coated with nuclear materials. So for a number of reasons, it didn't turn out practically, but that was the concept. It was named Kiwi because it was never designed to fly. It was named after the flightless bird, but it was tested successfully. And this is the concept that was later envisioned on orbit, where maybe we can use it for interplanetary travels. That program actually continued with NASA until the early 80s, when everything was wound down after the Apollo program. Anybody know what this is? This is the WS-125. This is the Lockheed candidate for a nuclear-powered airplane. All right? There were two designs in contention, actually. Lockheed had one, Convair had another. One of them had a direct cycle nuclear engine, and one had a closed cycle nuclear engine. I happened to give a talk to the Lockheed employees, the retired employees, a year ago, and a guy raised his hand and said, I was on the design team, and he's the one who gave me this picture, as a matter of fact. So this is what the Lockheed plane was supposed to look like. They actually built an NB-36H, which is a picture of the airplane you see in the foreground, put a 3-megawatt air-cooled reactor in it, and flew it. 215 flight test hours, 81 of which were with the reactor critical. Okay? Fortunately, none of it was over Georgia, I'm here to assure you. It was all over Texas and New Mexico. The reactor was not powering the airplane, but the question was, hey, what's the radiation levels? Can we make this work and all of that? They had huge amounts of shielding, and unfortunately, when they did all the computations and put the shielding in, they realized they had no room for bombs, and so they abandoned the program at some point. But nonetheless, it shows you how people were thinking about the potential of nuclear energy. Anybody know what this is? This is the 1958 Ford Nucleon. I'm not making this up, folks. Okay, this was a design proposal from the Ford Motor Company. It had actually it was a pressurized water reactor that you see back there where the trunk would normally be in a conventional automobile. The concept was you drive this thing for 10,000 miles, you motor into your nearby gas station, your obliging mechanic swaps it out with another reactor, and you drive away emissions-free, getting unlimited mileage out of a few uranium pellets. Needless to say, a working model of this was never built. Much less figuring out how to deal with a rear-end collision on Interstate 75, which could turn into a nuclear accident. But it does show you the kinds of things people were thinking about. What can we use this energy for? And there were others. I mean, there was Project Plowshares. Does that ring a bell? They were going to use atomic demolitions to dig a sea-level canal across the Isthmus of Panama. Okay? They were going to use nuclear radiation to preserve food. It works marvelously. I mean, you can preserve food for years without refrigeration, but the public acceptance becomes an issue, of course. And then finally, as I fondly remember when I was living up in Marietta as a kid, my favorite candy in those days was the atomic fireball. Anybody ever remember those things? You couldn't even keep them in your mouth. You had to take them out with your fingers to give your tongue a rest occasionally. So everything nuclear and atomic was new. It was the cutting-edge technology of its time. It was literally the dot-com of its time. All of these things failed. What didn't fail was this, and that was the adaptation of the military propulsion plant from the nuclear submarines to the production of electricity for commercial use. This is the Marble Hill plant being built in Indiana. It was ultimately later abandoned, but after the success of the Nautilus and nuclear propulsion throughout a range of naval vessels, there were 237 nuclear plants put on order in this country by utilities that obviously had no concept of what nuclear energy was all about. They've been burning coal for years, or gas in some cases, but they knew that this had the potential for dramatically changing the game, if you will, in electricity generation. I mean, the concept then was that they were going to generate electricity that was too cheap to meter. In other words, they were going to sell electricity like you do with your cable company. You were going to pay a fixed fee each month, and you could take as much electricity as you wanted because it was going to be so cheap. Okay? Incredible, thought process and incredible arrogance in some ways. And as I say, 237 nuclear plants were ordered from 1965 to 1978. Well, what happened in 1979? 3 Mile Island. March 28th, 1979, 4 in the morning. The parents in this room will remind ourselves that nothing good ever happens after midnight, and that certainly was validated in this case. And this industry was challenged in ways that it had not anticipated. It had been growing gangbusters. There were 54 vertically integrated utilities that were now operating nuclear power plants. They overestimated the market for electricity. Okay, they thought the demand was going to go up much more dramatically than it did, much as we've seen here recently. It took a downturn, as a matter of fact, economically, and they didn't have the need as much as they wanted. But the primary thing here was they underestimated the risks because they had had no experience with them. They thought that the nuclear reactor was just another way of turning water into steam and did not appreciate the unique character of that energy source. John Kenneth Galbraith's quote always comes to mind. If all else fails, immortality can always be assured by a spectacular error. And even now, the iconic picture of that cooling tower at 3 Mile Island that you see on the cover of Time magazine dated April 9th, 1979, with a banner across the top that says nuclear nightmare, colors everyone's perception about this energy source. The fact that everything worked pretty much as advertised from a safety perspective, that the amount of radiation released was 1/6 of what you get in a normal chest x-ray is immaterial. In the minds of many still today, that has dramatically changed the outcome. What did we see as a result of that? 97 plants were canceled. You can take a tour across this country visiting the shell of partially completed nuclear power plants that were abandoned. Companies lost billions. They walked away from projects like that one at Marble Hill. They'd invested $2.7 billion into that thing, and they abandoned it, turned it back to a greenfield site. But the most important piece was the American people had lost the trust that they had in this industry of our ability to use and control the safety of this technology. And that's always the challenge of advanced technologies. Because when people look at it and you've got the N word in your name, nuclear or something else that they don't understand, that they don't have a background in, they are frightened, and they trust people like you, like us, to do this well and to control it. And if you break that trust, if you rip that fabric, it can take and has taken decades to reweave and reknit in a meaningful way. And it's something we always need to remember as we consider the implications of the technologies, whatever they are, that we're a part of. So how did the U.S. industry deal with this? Well, they knew that the President's Commission on the 3 Mile Island accident, the so-called Kemeny Commission, named after Dr. Kemeny, who was then the president of Dartmouth College, they came up with 3 or 4 key recommendations. First off, you have to establish and police standards of excellence in this industry. Okay? Secondly, you need to have a way to effectively collect information and share it rapidly in the industry. The events at 3 Mile Island had occurred 18 months earlier at another commercial nuclear power plant. The report had not yet been written, much less shared with the broader industry. How might the outcome have been different if we had the ability to learn from each other? You need to have really established and accredited training programs. You need to have simulators to train operating crews and the like. All of those things came together, and they said, we've got to have some organization to do this, and the industry created the Institute of Nuclear Power Operations, which I now lead. The gentleman on the left is Bill Lee. He was leading Duke Power at the time, a visionary guy who saw potential here. He said, this industry does not have to go out of business. It is not just about our success, though, it's about our survival if we don't get this right. In order to begin to restore that trust, we have to demonstrate a legitimate self-regulatory capability, and we're going to form this organization called INPO. And we're going to empower it with the authorities and the influence that it needs to demand that pursuit of the standards of excellence that I described. But we got to find somebody to lead it, okay? Well, they started looking. They needed somebody with a nuclear background. Well, how do you do that when there is no nuclear industry yet? Well, you go to the nuclear navy, right? And so they started taking names to the acknowledged nuclear expert in the United States. And who would that be? Admiral Hyman Rickover, right? In the Navy, he was known as the kindly old gentleman. And he was one of those. He was old. And he was something of a curmudgeon in his reputation. And they would bring him names, and they brought him 9 names in a row, saying, hey, what about this guy? And Admiral Rickover, in his diplomatic and gentlemanly style, would say, he's no damn good. He's no damn good. Well, they knew they had the right guy when they brought him the name of the guy on the right there, Dennis Wilkinson. Remember that name? He was the first commanding officer of Nautilus and has now just retired as a 3-star admiral. When they knew they had the right guy, when they brought him his name to Rickover, and Rickover said, he's too good for you, they hired him, okay? And he was the first CEO of the company. Now, as the U.S. industry was wrestling with their problems, what happened in 1986? Within 1 month after I entered nuclear power school in Orlando, there is no relation, by the way, but that's the Chernobyl mishap, where an unforgiving design that's designed has unstable physics characteristics. They violated their own safety procedures, executing an unauthorized test. Basically, it was criminal action. They were never prosecuted because they all died in the explosion. But that created a demand internationally for something like INPO and resulted in the creation of the World Association of Nuclear Operators. I mention that only because I represent the U.S. industry in the World Association of Nuclear Operators as the CEO of INPO. So that's a little bit about how it all came together. This is what we were expected to do. And all of this became resident in INPO. This is our mission, to promote the highest levels of safety and reliability. Not minimum regulatory compliance, not good enough, but the pursuit of excellence in the operation of commercial nuclear power plants. And the industry has come back. I mean, we're now building new nuclear reactors in this country for the first time. The first 2 that are likely to come online are being built on the Savannah River here in Georgia by Southern Company at Plant Vogtle Units 3 and 4, 2 AP1000s generating 1,000 megawatts of electricity each. They should come online in 2016, 2017, and will be the first new nuclear reactors built in this country in decades. It generates 20% of our total electricity. We do by nuclear power, and the levels of performance are absolutely extraordinary on the part of the U.S. industry. These are facts, okay? Now, INPO, I failed to mention, but I should. INPO is a 501c3. Is anybody here a tax lawyer? Raise your hand. Don't be embarrassed, okay? All right. All right, I didn't think so. I'm not either. But a 501c3 under U.S. tax law is a charity, okay? So next time they come by with United Way, feel free to write in INPO and any 4 or 5 figure amount that you're comfortable with. No, seriously. The fact of the matter is, though, there are restrictions that come if you are a nonprofit and involved in the things that we do, and that is we are forbidden by law from doing advocacy. So I'm not here to sell you on nuclear power. It'd be a conflict of interest if the organization that was doing the evaluation, the ones that were doing the grades, the ones that were calling the balls and strikes in the industry, and that's what we do, were also involved in the promotion of the industry. I don't do that. But I do believe that if you're pursuing the goal of high levels of electricity generation, emissions-free, as increasingly that's become a metric for success, as we look towards the issues surrounding global warming and the like, there isn't anything else that can do that yet. And so the fact that now the top 6 and 8 of the top 10 performing nuclear reactors in the world are in the United States of America, no pun intended, is no accident. Okay, and while we don't take credit for that at INPO, we do believe we made contributions to the work that has been done by the industry. This is a picture of the big hole in the Georgia red clay that you could see if you went down to Savannah River and up to Savannah River, I guess, and looked at it. That's Plant Vogtle 3 and 4. You can see the cooling towers from 1 and 2 in the background there. So that construction is well underway. Billions of dollars, by the way. These things cost an average of about $5 billion each. Things have changed. The guy on the right there is Patrick Moore, one of the co-founders of Greenpeace, who has come out as one of the strongest proponents, advocates for nuclear energy. And the reason he's done that is what you see there. It's the only realistic solution to future power needs and emissions-free, okay, which is important to him. And so we're seeing a change in all of that. The reality, of course, is you need everything. You need a balanced portfolio, okay? It isn't just about nuclear. We ought to be doing renewables. We have to. I mean, I drove a Prius to this session here today. I believe in this stuff. Now, in my other garage is a Porsche 911, but that's a different story. I mean, I am a fighter pilot after all. Come on, you know. But the fact of the matter is, that's what you have to have. And we need hydro. But quite frankly, the production from hydro is declining as we take dams out of service and are worried about environmental concerns and the like. The price is low, so it makes sense these days. But you know, back before the bubble burst, you know, my broker, if I had a broker, before my 401k turned into a 201k, he would tell me I needed a balanced portfolio, right? Well, that's what we need as a hedge for our energy needs looking to the future, because you know, something's going to change. They're going to find out that the fracking that they're doing to get gas out of the ground injects you know, things, carcinogens into the groundwater. Who knows what they might find that can dramatically shape the reallocation of energy, and it would be helpful to have these capabilities already in existence as we go forward. And we're beginning to move in that direction in the United States. As I say, there are 4 reactors under construction now. There are 2 more being done by SCANA in South Carolina. And there are some others that are being considered, and perhaps when the economy comes back, that might make sense. This is what the NRC commissioner reminds us of, though, as we talk about the future of nuclear energy. There isn't going to be a future unless we continue to sustain the safe and reliable performance of the current fleet of operating reactors. I mean, that's the given, okay? That's the assumption that you have to have, okay? Now, if you go internationally, they don't understand what we're talking about when we talk nuclear renaissance. They go, wait a minute, we never stopped. Okay, and there's 65 nuclear reactors under construction internationally now, 27 of them in China. Not being considered, not being studied. I mean, there's holes in the ground, and they're putting rebar and nuclear-grade concrete in. And so there's 11 that are being pursued in Russia. There's 6 in India, and dozens more throughout the rest of the world. They're continuing to build apace. France, as you may be aware, generates 80% of their electricity by nuclear energy. And so there are a lot of folks that consider that this has to be the wave of the future. 442 operating reactors around the globe. How many reactors are there operating in the U.S.? Anybody know? People usually say 20, 30. There's 104 operating in the United States generating commercial nuclear power. We're not talking about test reactors or any of the research reactors or any of the things like we used to have at Tech, you know, the small subcritical type of reactors. I'm talking about high-level electricity generation. But you can see that even internationally, we're ahead of the average in generating 20% of our electricity by nuclear. This is the vision that we established for my company. We want to be known as the primary advocates for nuclear safety, not just domestically but internationally. It is all about the safety. Okay, it really is. I mean, you can have your own views about whether we ought to have nuclear energy, whether we ought to build more or not, but as long as we have them, as long as we've got those 104 plants, my position is that it needs to be done safely, and that's what my company is all about. Effective self-regulation. You can kind of say, well, wait a minute. You're a nonprofit, right? Yeah, true. Okay, where do you get your money? Well, I get it from the industry. I don't hold bake sales. I don't do anything like that. I mean, I tell them what it costs, and they give me the money. $107 million a year the industry pays to keep INPO running. And you can kind of say, well, gee, how does this self-regulatory model work? Does it really work effectively? Well, a lot of people asked about that. The reason I have a picture of the Gulf oil disaster from last summer is I got summoned to appear before the President's Commission on the Gulf oil spill. I was a witness. And the reason was that they are considering, in fact, they published a report last week, and if you've had a chance to take a look at it, they recommend in the report that the industry create an organization like INPO to establish and police standards of excellence in terms of their performance. And so these are the 5 things that make it work for us. I don't talk to the plant managers. I don't. I talk to the chief executives of the company. When we do an evaluation at their site, yeah, the plant manager and the folks that run it are there when we debrief, but I debrief with the CEO personally, okay? He hears that. I don't care whether he came from the food service industry. I don't care whether he was out of the financial sector. Many of these CEOs don't have technical experience that are running large utilities, but they're a part of the process and they're actively involved. All we do is nuclear safety. I don't do anything else. I don't do advocacy. We get pushed a lot. Well, why don't you do security? Maybe that's important. Yeah, it's important. It's not my job. It's not my core competency. I stick to what I do and what I do well. I've got 408 people up there in the Galleria. Most of them are nuclear experts. Many of them came out of the nuclear Navy, having commanded submarine squadrons and boats and all of that. Many of them came from the commercial industry. Many of them now are coming right out of institutions like Georgia Tech, because we're now hiring directly and training our own folks in order to get the kind of skills and diversity that we need. Industry support, it is complete. I mean, for a long time, it was a little tough. You know, who are these guys from the Navy, and most of the early founders of INPO were from the Navy, that are coming in to tell us in the utility business how to do business? Well, that was 31 years ago. We don't have that kind of relationship anymore. We've earned our credibility because we do what we do pretty well, okay? Accountability, it is without question, okay? Their insurance rates are set by the grades I give them. So there's a bottom line accountability associated with this. They have to correct the deficiencies that we identify, and believe me, we're like the ORS board. We always find something that they need to correct, and they do. But we come back every 2 years to check on them. I hold a CEO conference every year here in Atlanta. Every CEO of the utilities that operates a nuclear reactor has to come. It's focused exclusively on nuclear safety. I do an executive session behind closed doors with just the CEOs and their senior leaders. I review from top to bottom who's doing the best in the industry, who's doing the worst in the industry, and the folks that are at the bottom have to get up in front of their peers and explain how they got it in the ditch and what they're doing to get it out of the ditch. And so there's a real personal, high-level accountability associated with this nuclear enterprise that goes all the way to the top of those that are overseeing this energy source. Why is this important? Well, there are a lot of people that are contributing to this. I don't think we do it alone. We obviously do not. All these people have a role in all of this, and we're working to build a much more collaborative and collective approach to this. INPO, I believe, is as good as anybody else in the world at doing this, but we can learn from others, and we aren't necessarily at the top of everything we do, and all of these people have a perspective. I've been invited to co-chair the U.S. delegation to the IAEA Convention on Nuclear Safety this year, and I'll go and talk about the U.S. program in front of the United Nations, and they'll get a chance to question me about how we do it and why we do it the way we do, and compare and contrast with their own efforts. So there is a collaborative character to this that is entirely appropriate. But you got to want to do this, okay? You have to be committed to this. This is important, okay? Many of you have been following the events in Egypt, and Mohammed al-Baradei was in the square 2 days ago with a bullhorn talking to folks, and I met him when he was the Director General of the International Atomic Energy Agency. I heard him speak in Budapest a few years ago, and he spoke then about the promise of nuclear energy. And many of us assumed that he was going to talk, as he did, about, hey, high-level, baseload, low-cost energy, generation of electricity essential to the prosperity of all mankind. He talked about that. But there's a second promise of nuclear energy that he talked about, and that's the fact that those of us that are involved in overseeing this enterprise, whether you're operating it, or whether you're regulating it, or whether you're inspecting it, have an obligation to do this job as well as it can possibly be done. That's the second promise that we all have to make to our nation, to the world, and to ourselves, that that's how we're going to oversee this. And these are the folks that get it done. I don't take credit for this from an ivory tower here in Atlanta. I don't generate a bit of electricity unless the emergency diesel in the basement of my building is running. These are the folks that get it done. The folks out there at the deck plates, as we used to say in the Navy, the folks that every day come to work with that level of commitment to do this as well as it can possibly be done. Why is this important? This gets to the prosperity piece. This is a collage, a composition of the world at night. If you look at it, and if the lights were low, you can see a correlation between the location of the brightness of the lights, where electricity generation and consumption is highest, and prosperity. And I would even argue that you might also see a correlation between that and the democracies that underpin that. Okay? And if you don't think I'm being accurate, take a look at this comparison. Any problem defining where the 38th parallel is on the Korean Peninsula? You know where South Korea is, and north of the 38th parallel, things are very, very dark, literally and figuratively. And the message there is that democracy and prosperity and electricity and energy consumption go hand in hand, whether we want it that way or not. That's the reality of the world in which we live. This is the per capita electricity consumption, and you can draw your own conclusions out of this. Guess who's going to be on the far right? Yep, those are the developed countries out there, and you can see Russia is about half that, and everybody else lags considerably, particularly the folks down in Africa. Do you know that 25% of the world today does not have access to electricity? Well, that means they don't have, incubators for premature babies, or X-ray or CT scans, or any of the things that come for well-being. They don't have things that pump water, or any of the most basic things that we hold dear and that are essential, not just to prosperity, but to health and well-being going forward. 15% of the world's population has over $40,000 a year per capita income, and 85% has less than $2,000 a year per capita income. What's the linkage to energy consumption? This is a Goldman Sachs study that shows if you want a 1% increase in per capita income, it requires a 0.5% increase in the generation of electricity. Okay? So there is a linkage, whether you like it or not. Now, in a perfect world, we'd like to be able to decouple that so that it isn't as impactful on the environment and all of that, but no one's figured out a way to do that now. That's the reason China is starting up a 1,000 megawatt coal plant every week now. Every week. And they don't have scrubbers or any of the anti-pollution equipment on them that you see in this country, because they're struggling to catch up with the demands of a growing middle class as their prosperity increases dramatically. So there's a linkage here, okay? And there's a demand here, and if you want to you can't have it both ways. I mean, as much as I like my Prius, and as much as I like renewables, and as much as I like wind and solar, if you want significant levels of baseload electricity generation capability, and you don't want to put anything into the environment. We put 2.5 billion, that's with a B, back when we thought that was a big number, you remember, before 2 years ago? Billion metric tons of stuff into the air every year in this country, generating electricity with gas and coal. I don't care what your views are on global warming, that's not healthy. That's not healthy, and that needs to change. And so we've got to find a way to do that, and we've got to help the world find a way to do that. This is my favorite quote from Winston Churchill. When somebody told him that they were doing their best, he said, "That's not enough. It's not enough to do your best. You have to do what's needed, what's required to get it done." And that's where leadership comes in. I told you I wasn't going to give you the answers, and I'm not. But I am going to tell you some of the experiences that I've gained in my journey. I'm watching my clock here. How am I doing, okay? Alex, keep me honest, all right. All right. These are some assumptions, if you will. My last job, I worked for a guy who was pretty demanding. We'd take him a plan, and he wouldn't even study the plan. He'd assume that if you took enough time to write the plan, that it would work. Plans are like turning the crank. He'd always ask you about the assumptions. That's what I learned from working for Donald Rumsfeld. All right. First off, these are my observations, if you will, my assumptions about leadership before we get into a bit more specifics. First off, leadership is not management. With apologies for the name of the school here, we need both, okay? Sometimes we blur the terms, though. We use them interchangeably, and I think that's a mistake, and it doesn't do it justice. You know, and the way I think about it simplistically, and this is just Jim Ellis's definition, so I apologize in advance to any of the professors that are in the room here. My view is that you manage things and processes and you lead people, okay? And both are necessary for the effective functioning of organizations and the like. Years ago, when I was a young Navy test pilot, I worked I worked with a flight test engineer who was then on the early days of what we then called remotely piloted vehicles. Now they're called UAVs, pilotless airplanes. And he was a great proponent of that. And he did not think much about pilots. In fact, he defined pilots as following. He said, a pilot is nothing more than a programmable, nonlinear servo mechanism that can be produced cheaply in 9 months by unskilled labor. Well, if you think about people in those terms, perhaps you do manage people. But if you realize that they're human beings, that they have goals and aspirations, that they have things that they care about, they have families, they have their own concerns, and they have a work-life balance and all of those other things, I would submit that when the push comes to shove, you need to lead those nonlinear programmable servo mechanisms, not manage them. And we need to be careful about using those terms too interchangeably. Again, my assumption. I mentioned this to some of the folks that I met with before we convened. Leadership is a full contact sport, folks, okay? We are not perfectionists. We're human beings, okay? We're going to make mistakes. But the fact is, you're in this game, whether you want to be or not. Maybe you didn't aspire to become a leader. Maybe you just inherited it. Maybe you got promoted and all of a sudden there you are. Or maybe the person who had the responsibility left, got fired, retired, whatever, and you found yourself there. Maybe you just developed that because of the credibility that you have. You know, you became an expert and people came to you and you became the de facto leader. Doesn't matter. Many of you are there already, and I guarantee you, through your life, you will become there. Not just in the workplace, but in the home, in the church, in the schools, and all of those other things that are an important part of society. But the point here is you're going to get bruised and bloodied. You're going to make mistakes. You're going to foul things up. You're going to wish you'd done things differently. Okay? So don't expect perfection from yourself. 30, 40 years later, I can still sit there and think back and slap my forehead and suck my teeth and go, man, I sure handled that badly. Okay? But the question is, what do you learn from that? What do you change and go forward? How do you adjust as a result and commit to never making that same mistake again? Okay? That's the key. There is no single leadership style. You expect me to stand up here and I'll let Alan do that in a chrome helmet with a patent costume, and he does a great shtick of that if you've never heard him do it. Alan Price in the back. If that's your vision of leadership and you think that's what you have to be, you're wrong, I would argue. Okay? There are as many effective leadership styles as there are people in this room. Okay? And the reality is you have to find your own leadership style. And then what you don't like about it, you change as you go. Okay? And I argue against myself. There is a single leadership style, and it's yours. Okay? And the secret is the ability to modify it and to change and to learn and to grow in all of that. None of us is sprung fully formed as the perfect leader. We all evolve as we go through life. And I'm fond of saying, you know, don't fake it. Okay? You cannot be what you are not, but you can change what you are. And that's the message in all of this. Don't try and pretend to be something. Just keep making something a part of you to the fact where it becomes habit. And it is you now. And it's something you learn from somebody else, something you envy or emulate, something you admire in a parent, a teacher, or a colleague, or something like that. Hey, that's okay. Steal shamelessly from them. But ultimately make it part of yourself. And then you're on the track to effective leadership. It is always situational. Okay? Anybody ever hear anybody say, hey, I can't help it, that's just the way I am? You know, that's baloney. We're all practicing situational interactions all the time. How many of you talk to your colleagues or your classmates in the same way that you do to the professor or the dean or the head of the institution? I mean, of course not. You know, and if you're older and like me, you're in the workplace, you don't talk the same way to your boss or your board of directors that you do to your employees. So it is by definition situational. And you have to learn the ability to adapt your approach while not compromising your principles. Anybody here ever hear of a guy named Stephen Covey? Anybody ever? You will not believe this, but I wrote a chapter in one of Stephen Covey's books. This is not a joke. I thought it was when he called, but It was a bestseller. It sold 3 copies, I think. One is in the Library of Congress. Covey has one, and I think I have one that he signed for me. The title of it was The Nature of Leadership, and it was kind of one of his esoteric ones. Got some great photos, but the subject was, what lessons about leadership have you learned from nature? And the example I gave him, and somebody told him, hey, call Jim Ellis. He'll talk to you, was from my days of commanding a nuclear aircraft carrier. Anybody ever been aboard a nuclear aircraft carrier? 100,000 tons, 1,092 feet long, just your average small town built on top of 2 nuclear reactors and underneath an international airport that travels 75% of the Earth's surface at in excess of 30 knots. You know, big piece of machinery, okay, is the message and all that. But as big as it was, when the seas would build more than 20 to 25 feet, if you went straight into the seas, the thing would pound unmercifully. It would actually rip things off the side of the ship. It would break airplanes loose that were tied down with 18 chains, and they'd cascade and roll around the deck. But I found that if you adjusted course 5 degrees either side, the ride would smooth out dramatically. Okay? It would stop pounding, and you could actually accelerate. And so by zigzagging a bit, taking a little bit of a different tack, you could go faster. You'd arrive at your destination intact, nothing broken, and about the same time as you would have if you'd gone straight into it, or faster. So that was my lesson for Stephen Covey in situational leadership, if you will. Sometimes you just have to change your approach a bit. You don't compromise your principles. Those are inviolate. You got to stand for something, okay? But how you voice it, how you approach it, how confrontational you get, the way in which you present it, there's lots of ways in which we can subtly alter our style, if you will, and our situational approach that allows us to accomplish what we intended to do and not compromise the principle. Leadership is either good or bad. There is no such thing as neutral leadership. Leadership, like in physics, abhors a vacuum. Okay? By definition, leadership is about giving your folks, the folks that you work with, the things they need, the resources they need, the support they need, the guidance they need, the direction they need. Which way are we going, boss? There they go again. I must hurry after them, for I am their leader. You know, one of those kinds of things. People need these things to make it work. And so the absence of leadership, by definition, is bad. Anybody here ever work with or around a bad leader? Come on, I have. All right, when I was the executive officer of a nuclear aircraft carrier, that's the number 2 guy, I worked for a guy who was very abrasive and very outgoing. He had 3 favorite sayings. The first was, when I want your opinion, I will give it to you. True. His second favorite saying is, what good is power if I can't abuse it? And his third, and my favorite saying, was, when the king is unhappy, one of the little people must die. And he would actually say these things in public. I mean, it was astounding. I mean, the crew loved me. Why? Because I wasn't him, you know? So my point here is, hey, it's got to be good, or by definition, it's bad. And we have to continue to learn. As I said earlier, it never stops. It's a journey that we're all on. And no matter how old you are, a grizzled old guy like me, and as I mentioned to the folks that I was with before we met, and Alex very thoughtfully did not read my entire CV, because if he had, it would have told you 2 things about me. First, that I'm old, and second, that I can't hold a job. But the fact of the matter is, all of those things are learning opportunities, but sometimes you need to create your own learning opportunities. Okay? Don't shut things off. Don't say, well, gee, I'm in my comfort zone. It's amazing how much you learn from dropping yourself into something that perhaps wasn't your first choice. Okay? In the military, we have a process by which they ask you where you want to go and what you want to do next, and then they ignore it and send you somewhere else, you know. And many, many times, I never got any of those first 3 things on my preference card. But where I ended up was a marvelous opportunity as a result. And so don't fail to learn from those experiences. And then finally, one of the principles that I believe in about leadership is that we need to take the organizational chart, that pyramid that we all see, or that triangle, you know, with a leader at the top and all these support functions. We need to take it and we need to turn it on its head. And that the role of an effective leader is not to sit there in the corner office in the big mahogany desk and have people kind of walk in and genuflect and bow and place sacrificial offerings in the inbox and then back out so as not to show disrespect by turning their back. That isn't what leaders do. okay? If that's your vision of a leader, I would offer it might be time to rethink that. Because the best leaders ask themselves the question every day, what can I do to make the life of my direct reports easier? What is it they need that I can give them? Sometimes it's resources, sometimes it's guidance, sometimes it's inspiration, and occasionally you got to cover for them when they screw up and shelter them when it was well-meaning and not ill-intended. And so think of this as the pyramid balanced on its head. I know all of you are engineers and you'll tell me it's statically unstable, right? It won't stay balanced on its head like that. But think about it. Just imagine it for a bit, that's the way it looks. And now you're doing that for the folks that report to you, and they're doing it for the folks that report to them. And so on and so on. And the folks that are really doing the work, the folks in those helmets that I showed you earlier in the utility industry, are the ones that are really getting all of the support of the rest of that organization. Think about it in that context sometimes, and I would argue that we might be better served by that. If Harry were to say this today, he would obviously not use the word men, but think of it in the context of when it was uttered, and the point here is about leadership. Okay, without it, society stands still. Okay, and I would argue society might even go backwards. Okay, that's what it takes. That's why leadership is so important. The technical piece is hugely important, don't get me wrong. And I'm a part of a technical industry and have been part of technology. I've been a techie all my life, okay? But the fact of the matter is, the thing that makes the difference is leadership. When I came into the Navy fighter community, there were 26 F-4 squadrons in the Navy. And I got assigned to one. That's what you did, you know. But it's very clear that some of them were very, very good, and some of them were lousy. They were operating the same equipment. They drew from the same training pipeline. They had the same parts supply. They had the, so what made the difference? Everything else should have been identical. Why wasn't the performance identical? And it took me a while to realize that this most significant difference is leadership. So I told you I didn't have all the answers, but I'll tell you my card, if you will. Through the years, as I try to decide, as you will, I mean, we've heard from John, he's got a job. Yay, all right. All of you will have that opportunity at some point to make a choice. You'll get offered a job. You'll be a part of this group or this team, or you'll decide which classes you're going to take or which school you're going to go to for graduate work or whatever. You'll make choices about who you want to associate with. What do you want to be a part of? I established through the years a criteria that I used, and being a Navy guy and trying to be cute, and since they all began with C, I called them the 7 C's. Get it? Come on, come on, come on. Be with me. I know it's late, all right? There's beer waiting. Come on. All right. These are they. The first of them is commitment, okay? I look for people and organizations that are genuinely committed. And ever been to a party where you're talking to somebody and all of a sudden you realize that they're looking over your shoulder to see if somebody more important, or in my case, better looking, just came in the room? You know, they're not really committed to this conversation. They're not into you. You're just a placeholder for them. Well, I look for people that want to be a part of the organization, that want to make it succeed, that want to be part of the team. Now, they may have goals longer term that, hey, this is just the first step of my career, and that's just fine. But while they're here, they're passionate about what they're doing. And that's important to me. Commitment. The second is competence. All right? And that isn't just the grade point average or the like. The competencies cover all of those things, some of them out of the assumptions I talked about earlier. Sometimes it's the so-called soft skills. You ever hear them called that? Well, I got news for you. They're really hard, these soft skills, okay? You know, how well do you communicate? How well do you listen? How well do you understand that listening is not the same as not talking? It really isn't, okay? You know, if you're thinking about that zinger you're going to throw into the conversation as soon as you get an opening, you're probably not hearing what folks have to say. But these are the kinds of competencies you have to create, you have to develop. And you have to decide for yourself when you're weakest. We're our own worst critics, if we're really honest about it. We know where we're weak. We know the things we don't do as well as we want to. So change it, okay? We can do that. And so understand your competencies and be a part of a competent organization. Credibility. You say, wait a minute, you just talked about this. No, I didn't. Competency is what you are. Credibility is what people think you are. They're not the same. They're not the same. Okay? So think about it in those terms. How are you viewed in that 360 in today's parlance? I mean, you know what you are and what you're capable of doing, but what do other people think you're capable of doing? Do people want to be on your team? Do they want to associate with you? When you walk in the room, does this conversation stop? Interesting question, isn't it? You know? So think about it from that context. Do you have credibility with your peers and the organization that you're a part of? You'd be surprised how you may think of yourself in one context and then you get this feedback from others and you realize, ooh, I didn't know I did that. So listen to those voices. You got to be able to communicate. I talked about it earlier. Communication is two-way. It's talking and listening, transmitting and receiving. And remember that listening is not the same as not talking. You got to have a sense of compassion in this world, folks. Okay? Things are not always going to go well. Can you deliver messages to people that need to be delivered and do it in a way that leaves them with their self-respect? Years ago, somebody gave me a book by Dag Hammarskjöld. None of you are old enough to know who he was. He was the second Secretary General of the United Nations. He died tragically in a plane crash in Africa in 1961. I extracted a quote from that I kept on my desk for many, many years in the previous life that I was a part of. And the quote went something like this: "Your position never gives you the right to command. It only imposes on you the obligation to so conduct yourself that others can receive your command without being humiliated." This is not about embarrassment. This is not about making people feel small. This is about having a sense of understanding that people may have different standards than you do. They may have different demands in terms of work-life balance. Okay? You cannot expect that everybody is going to work just as hard as you do. They have different priorities. They have different elements in their life of which you may be completely unaware. And so you need to have that sense of compassion, even when things don't go well, that allows you to deliver a difficult message and still leave people with their humanity intact. You got to have courage. Now you say, yeah, easy for you to say, you know. I'm not talking about me going up on the dark night on a flight deck of an aircraft carrier, climbing into an F-14 and taxiing into the CAT and being shot off into the darkness in 20-foot seas. There is no doubt you're going flying, by the way. There may be a question as to how long, but there's no doubt you're going flying, all right, when that catapult fires. But that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about the courageous choices that everyone has to make every day in their lives, no matter what you do. Are you willing to speak truth to power? Are you willing to tell your boss the truth when it needs to be told? That's part of the courage, too. The thing that I most admire, one of the most courageous events I ever saw, was when I happened to be in command of that nuclear aircraft carrier. These are pretty demanding times. We were headed off to Desert Storm. We were going someplace where it was important that this be done well. And occasionally, in a crew of 6,000, as you might imagine, somebody kind of gets into trouble, okay? They go to captain's mast, right? Well, I had a 2-strike and you're out rule, all right? That, hey, we'll give you one chance, but if you come back to captain's mast with the same offense, you're gone. You're going to be processed. You're out of the Navy. I don't have time for you. I got 5,999 folks that really want to do the job and deserve my attention, and it's over for you. That was the rule. Well, as luck would have it, when you have a rule, one day somebody came to captain's mast, okay? Young sailor, same infraction twice in a row of some significance, not overwhelmingly so, and you're out of here. Okay? Captain's mast was over. I go back to the bridge, 17 floors up, by the way, no elevators, okay? And I'm sitting there in the at-sea cabin just after the bridge. It's 1 o'clock in the morning, and there is a knock on my door. And it is the chief petty officer who runs the division in which this sailor is assigned. And he has climbed all the way up there to talk to me, and he says, "Captain, I want an exception to your policy." I'd had this policy in place for 2 years, folks. Everybody knew it. And he came to ask for an exception. I said, "Why, Chief?" He said, "This young man was in 16 foster homes before he joined the Navy. I think I'm making a difference with him, and I think I can turn him around, and I just need a little bit more time, and I want you to give me that time." Now that's courage, folks. It's not courage in the face of hostile fire, but I guarantee you that took courage for him to come all the way up there and ask me for an exception for a policy that he knew that I had instituted for appropriate reasons 2 years earlier. So that's what I mean when I talk of courage. You got to have that ability to do what you think is right, no matter what everybody tells you the probabilities of success are. And then finally, my last one, and I stole it from baseball, and I did it because I needed a C. All right. you got to be able to get it done. You got to be able to deliver. There's wonderful people that can go out there and be visionaries, and they have wonderful plans and great dreams, and they put together all sorts of processes, but at the end of the day, it doesn't quite happen, you know? So in the final analysis, one of the criteria that I set for organizations that I want to be a part of and people that I wanted to be associated with, they got to be able to be a closer. You got to be able to deliver. You got to be able to push it, to suck it up, to grit your teeth, to go through the hard times, and to get it done. So these are my 7 C's. Now you think, well, gee, this is awfully critical. What are you judging this against, everybody you meet against this? Yeah, to some degree I am. But you know, it's also not a bad list to have on that bathroom mirror when I'm looking at myself in the mirror in the morning and say, hey, how am I doing in each of these things? It's not a bad way. You create your own, okay? You can call them the 5 L's. You can do whatever you want, okay? It won't be as cute as 7 C's, but you get my drift. You know, you ought to have some criteria. What is it that's important to you? What is it you value? And that's what this is reflected in, and that's what I use. There's a great quote from Eric Hoffer, who is you probably don't know him either. He was a philosopher longshoreman, an interesting combination, in the docks of San Francisco many, many years ago. And it talks about people who adapt and people who learn and people who grow through their life. And I like it because, well, I just like it, you know. You got to be able to learn. The learned are the folks that think they know it all, that think that they've already learned all that's necessary, and they're the ones that are going to get left behind. So, where am I going? In terms of energy, we're headed in this direction. There's a future out there. We can't quite see what it looks like, but you know, I think in the energy business, it's going to be important not just for success and economic prosperity in this country, but for the success of the world. I think this is going to be an essential element of the democratization that has to take place around the world. And we have to figure out ways to do this that balance the ecological concerns and the crying need that 25% of the population has for things that we already take for granted. And here's the issue, of course. It's all a question of how, and it's the how that makes all the difference. Thank you.